The other person that we asked to do a little bit of reflecting on the spirit in jazz was a guy by the name of Ben MacRae. So I'll tell you a little bit about Ben. Ben, young, 22 years old, was baptized and joined the church at Easter. He's the guy that started the big band, and in many ways, I would say another old soul. But digging deeply into Christianity. So he's got a bit of experience with Dutch Catholicism, a little bit with the United Church out the valley in Abbotsford. That's where he grew up with his grandparents. And but again, he's just one of those people that's in the best sense of the word, intensely curious. So these are his remarks for us, and I've got copies if anybody wants them. And he's off with a group called Grand Slam, which plays traditional jazz, New Orleans jazz, over on Pender Island. They go over there once a year to stay with his aunt and do 3 or 4 concerts. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my humble opinion with you all. Tremendous respect for each of you as musicians, theologues, and activists that are forging a new way forward for the universal church. I love that phrase.
I just want to go dun-dun-dun-dun.
Exactly. Okay, that's enough. I'd like to extend my sincere apology for not being able to deliver my opinion in person. As you are reading this, I will be on tour, but I am with you in spirit. Adele posed a very thought-provoking question. How do you see the spirit at work in jazz worship? I've given these words a great deal of thought, and I feel as if the question is not one that is easily answered in a single letter. Rather, it's a question I will be considering for the rest of my natural life through thought and song. Jazz is a music that is born of the world, a harmonious blend of African musical stylings that become infused with the music of the many cultures that inhabited New Orleans at the break of the early 20th century. It's a musical revolution that mixed the music of Western Europe with the burgeoning North American song and gospel interplay, that incorporated sounds from Latin America and the Caribbean in a town that had a long and conflicted history. Jazz is the story of many cultures coming together to create a new musical language, one that still captivates musicians and audiences alike in the 21st century. It's a diverse range of expression, from Scott Joplin to Charlie Parker to Miles Davis, from Louis Armstrong to Ornette Coleman, from Duke Ellington to Dave Brubeck. But how is the Spirit active in jazz worship? As I see it, the Spirit has always been at work in this medium. Right from its inception, the Spirit has been calling people to be reconciled by the grace of Christ through participation in a multi-ethnic music, a medium that defies bigotry, sexism, social constraints, and upholds freedom of musical self-expression. Another aspect of the Spirit at work in jazz is the concept of what is jazz? What connects such disparate musicians, such as Scott Joplin to Miles Davis or Ornette Coleman? One cannot simply have a list of what qualities jazz is. Does it not contain swing, advanced harmonic concepts, identifiable rhythmic constructs, a standard instrumentation? Does it need a certain venue, performance practice, or audience? Does jazz mean an approach to playing or composition? The answer, I think, to this is no. As admirers of this beautiful tradition, we often know more when something is not jazz than when it is. I'm more and more of the opinion that the one true uniting factor of all jazz musicians is the invisible mark of the Holy Spirit that ties the jazz diaspora together. How else could we identify this music? A music that is fed by so many traditions and cultures, one that is simultaneously related to all of its ancestral styles, but to this day remains its own unique category. Once again, I see the Spirit at work here in reconciling people to God via Christ. I think my final remarks are going to focus back on Adele's original question. How do you see the Spirit at work in jazz worship? Given the history I've just outlined, the Spirit uses this untamed elegance, as Victor Goines so aptly named his suite, to reach into untamed elegance. Anyhow, to reach into the hearts of musicians and congregants alike to effect change. By choosing a medium that is so relatable to all, yet extremely foreign at the same time, the Spirit is able to connect with all peoples, regardless of race, sex, socioeconomic profile, using a tool that has and continues to defy boundaries. Jazz has and always will be a music of the people, for the people, and a music that continues to challenge us and make better of ourselves. Is Christ not the same? As I see it, the Spirit also uses one's jazz signature hallmarks, improvisation, to communicate with both performer and listener alike. Jazz improvisation demands a level of attention, maturity, calmness, depth of listening, harmonic rhythmic interplay, and unlike no other tradition, improvisation. What this level of artistic expression requires above all else is the call to listen to others and to put the music ahead of the individual's wants, desires, and will. I believe that through this deep engagement with music, the Spirit creates space to be heard. I'm currently reading Music and Theology by Don Selliers, and his central provocation is, does music lead us to theology, or does theology lead us to music? The answer is yes. It's through both means that Christ through the Spirit reconciles us to himself, much like a wildly out-of-tune instrument that is brought into accord by a master musician. Jazz musicking provides some of the most fertile ground for a musician to hear not only music, but the call to be reconciled through Christ's grace, to amplify that call to the people around them. The more I ponder these questions and try to study, search, and pray for guidance, the more I truly realize that God is active in all things, and that through mediums such as jazz, that demand self-discipline, reflection, and servitude, we can glean but the faintest gift of God's glory.
I know vaguely that improvisation is an important part of jazz. But perhaps you can, somebody, maybe Dan or Tom, can explain more what improvisation is and why it is one of the core or near the core of jazz. It's a question about the technology.
What's a PhD?
The technique of music rather than
Spontaneous composition.
Yeah.
Or is it spontaneous combustion?
Maybe both ends.
So when you have that break from the full ensemble and one musician goes off, that's the improvisation and plays, and then the ensemble comes back together again. Is that?
I think that's one way of thinking about it, but I would say it's also bigger than that, because
Yeah.
let's say we're going to play a tune. Let's say we decide to play a Cole Porter tune and we both know it. The question would be, what are we going to do to introduce the tune? That could be entirely improvised. Well, and then even if she's singing the melody, she's going to change she's going to make it personal.
Yeah.
Change the way some things are phrased, and then I have opportunities to respond. So it's actually, I think of it as like an ongoing kind of a circular thing. But what's interesting is that I feel like I'm still doing the same thing. Like I'm just listening for what might work and trying to get that music out of my head onto the instrument. And then there's like a feedback loop, but it's kind of like an ongoing conversation. I don't know if that, but then so after the head or after the main melodic material, then we would have solos. So that would follow the order. but even the context is being improvised. So the soloist is playing, maybe it's sax, pass the ball to Ron, Ron's gonna play. We don't know how long he's gonna play. But,
How
but it's
wrong?
following.
How wrong and
How
wrong.
wrong?
But there is an underlying song structure, which is circular, usually. But all that stuff is improvised too.
And, but the improvisation starts at a certain note and has to finish at a certain note, or maybe a different note, so that the group can come back together again?
Well, so what'll happen is that usually there'll be some communication about like, at a certain point, Ron's solo would end.
You also have phrases, like you can hear the phrase, yeah.
Oh, like in
the
an
sentence
overture.
structure, you know,
Yeah.
you can kind of hear when
Yeah.
that's coming up through the chord progressions.
Yeah.
But
the
there's
other-
also a conversation too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even though the lead instrument might be doing that, there's tiddly bits being brought in from
Yeah, noodling.
noodling,
Yeah.
from the drums or any of the other
Yeah.
players. It isn't,
Yeah.
they're not just sort of knocking out the same thing each time too. They may be responding to what I just said.
Mm.
You may not notice that because, let's say, you know, the focus is on, let's say, the sax, and it's fairly obvious that there's something different happening there. But when you listen in a bigger context, you can hear what the keyboard's done in response to that, or the drums, or one exercise Dan gave us at one point was, okay, when you're doing your improv, just listen to the ride cymbal on the drummer and play off of what he's doing. So you're still doing your improvisation. He's more aware that everybody's listening to what he's doing there, and then rhythmically you're kind of, so there's a,
Drawing everybody back together.
yeah, that's just one exercise, but you're kind of listening to that whole context when you're soloing.
I, as a worship leader in Stevens, I notice the musicians looking at each other.
Yeah.
And one of them will start nodding and then start warming up the instrument, you know, getting rid of the fiddle or whatever, and then take over.
Yeah. And so what you often notice is
The head nods.
they lean in the head nods.
Yeah.
Or they'll do this, which means keep playing.
Yeah.
Another cycle.
Another cycle. Yeah.
Maybe,
Yeah. And so when I've been using jazz in the consulting work with organizations and leaders in leadership, there were two people really early on in my research in that area. One was a guy by the name of Donald Schoen, who taught education at MIT. And he was an amateur jazz musician, played the piano and clarinet. And he wrote a book called The Reflective Practitioner. So his idea was, which I think, you know, really should be resurrected as a foundation for theological education these days. Because his argument is that you learn best in practice. So it's practicing, it's the practitioner. He was talking primarily about legal education and medical education. The best place to learn is when you're in practice rather than in the classroom. That was the dichotomy that he was naming. And you are reflecting on that practice in your conversations. And so he was one of the ones that said, look, the most common form of jazz in human experience is ordinary conversation. Because you've got structure, vocabulary, and grammar that allows you to communicate with each other. Every time you use it, you improvise. So if you're talking about the liturgical theology of Augustine, and you talk about it for a minute, the next time you open your mouth to talk about it, you're going to talk about it differently. Different tone of voice, different set of words, maybe even a different set of ideas, because as you've been articulating what you used to think, you think something else.
Mhm.
And so so that improvisation
Yeah. Oh, that's
is,
really
here's the
cool.
structure, but be attentive to the way in which you are changing in having that conversation.
Yeah.
And so when I was teaching preaching, you taught preaching as well, every now and then they'd be desperate enough to come to the church historian and say, can you fill in for the guy on sabbatical? But one of the things I would talk about is the way in which, I mean, most people think of a sermon as a monologue. Right? It's a 20, 30-minute monologue, hopefully 20, not 45. But I said, and this was one of the things that Tom pointed out, set it in a broader context. Right? I mean, the sermon is part of your ongoing conversation with the congregation.
And with the scripture.
And with the scripture, and with
The
the community, and and the tradition. And so it's that, if you're a good preacher, there's that call and response. So one of my historical projects was to write the history of Knox College for their 150th anniversary. And one of the things I wanted to do was find out whether they were preparing people for ministry well. So I didn't just want to look at it through the college's perspective, but I wanted to find out what the church expected of ministers, and then how well Knox was, which was not terribly popular among the faculty at Knox, but that's another story. But how do you find out what the church expects of its ministers? So we read 1,000 obituaries. Because in the back of the Acts and Proceedings of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, there's, half to the third page, exactly, memorial minutes. And so we read 100 years of obituaries, 1,000 of them. And we were looking for two things. What are the functions that are named, and the adjectives used to describe the functions? And to my surprise, over that 100 years, across all of the regions of Canada, the same 4 functions and the order of the importance of those functions were consistent. So it was pastor, preacher, presbyter, in other words, involved in the larger church, and citizen. Now, hey Pam. Pastor and preacher, the internal stuff in the congregation was more important than citizen, or than presbyter and citizen, but they occurred often enough that it was 4 dimensions of one calling rather than specializations. And especially for Presbyterians, that importance of pastor preceding preacher was really significant. And so what I did with that was to say, look, and you never go to obituaries to find out facts, right? So these are memorial peons of praise to friends. And so, but if you wanted to find out what the culture thinks is good, the friend isn't going to say anything negative. I mean, they're going to, kind of praise them for the things that are valued by the culture. So that was, but that sense of being in connection, compassionate connection with the congregation as the foundation for good preaching, and then for involvement in the larger church and involvement in the community, I thought was really significant. But it's that social context for the conversation that Tom and Dan were talking about yesterday.
Call and response seems so essential.
Yeah.
That improvising is responding to whether it's accompanying or flowing with and listening to a ride cymbal. And there's the philosopher I mentioned yesterday, Emmanuel Levinas, who's a Jewish philosopher, talks about speech being a second act because you're summoned first by another who summons a response. And I like that. And would preaching look differently if it's seen as not the primary thing, but a response to the kinds of thing you're talking about, to the pastoral? So playing is a second act. That's having first received something that invites a response.
Yeah. Any other comments about Ben's stuff?
I like his paragraph where he says, right from its inception, the Spirit has been calling people to be reconciled by the grace of Christ through participation in multi-ethnic music.
Yeah.
A medium that defies all these context these, like the bigotry, the sexism, social constraints, and upholds freedom of musical expression. And I almost see that as a vehicle for change, just on a wider
Yeah.
level too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wrote down justice.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
justice,
yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
yes, yes,
yeah. But
Not
it
this
is,
word, but I heard, that was a beautiful
It
phrase.
is.
yeah,
I just
and
love
it's just
that.
that idea of music that defies all of those
The
divisions.
Yeah.
restrictive boundaries.
Yeah,
That's right,
yeah.
yeah, I love that.